All right, good morning, everybody. We appreciate you taking time today to join us in this conversation, presentation, brainstorming session about taking the first and next steps for developing a fire needs assessment for the state of Minnesota. And today we're going to hear examples from experts in the region who've done this project in the state of Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. My name's Paul Priestley. I'm prescribed fire coordinator for the Nature Conservancy in Minnesota. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe people, is what we now call Cushing, Minnesota. Last year, we were successful in securing funds from the Cohesive Fire Strategy Program through the USDA to secure funds to collaborate and develop this fire needs assessment for the state of Minnesota. And I'd just like to acknowledge the partners throughout the state that have helped push this idea along for years, and kind of excited to see it get put into action and make this a true Minnesota collaborative effort. So thank you all for your involvement and over time and moving forward too in the coming years. So, and especially thanks to our presenters today for joining us. So what we're planning to do today is we're going to have a chronological order of the presentations of the states of the projects that these were completed in. So Illinois was done first, and then most recently was Michigan, so we'll finish up with them. We'll let our three presenters go in order, and then we'll have a 10 to 15 minute break after that, and then we'll come back for a panel and a Q&A session with the group. Just some housekeeping to keep us on track today and keep us on time. We ask that you disable your video and audio for the course of the presentations, and we can revisit that during the discussion time. But if you experience any technical difficulties, try logging on and logging back out and see if that works. We can also have Jack McGowan is going to be the meeting logistics expert in the background handling these things. So if you have any issues, please reach out to him. He's also listed his phone number here graciously to contact him for any immediate needs. Jack, you want to jump in and say hi?
Hi, everybody. I'm not even going to try to turn my video on since I'm trying to still admit people. So, but welcome. Thanks for coming, and take it away, Paul.
All right. So Jack's also going to provide this resource to have this presentation recorded and archived on the Fire Science Consortium library webpage. Another housekeeping thing is we'd like to hold all the questions and discussion until after all three presenters have had a chance to complete their presentations. And then we'll kick it off with a Q&A session led by Mike Litch from the Forest Stewards Guild. Mike, you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so my name is Mike Lynch, Forest Stewards Guild. We'll talk a little bit later, but we'll be working with, well, all of you, but especially with Paul here to help develop this fire needs assessment. So looking forward to hearing all the feedback from everybody here today and crafting a great product.
All right, thanks, Mike. So we're going to try to utilize the chat box for questions during that time frame. And just to keep the focus of the conversation, we ask that we try to keep the content of those questions based on specifics to the Minnesota project and how that's going to help us move forward. So with that, thanks again for being here. We appreciate your time. And I'm going to pass it off to Bill Kleiman here. I'll stop sharing, Bill.
Good morning. Nice to be here. Let me share my screen. All right, you should be able to see the Illinois Prescribed Fire Council screen there. I'll try and keep this short, and then I don't know how eloquent I can go on for 30 minutes, but I I can talk for some time here, and I look forward to your questions later. I think this story, it took us 10 years to get to an Illinois fire needs assessment. I heard a presentation by my Arkansas colleagues with the Nature Conservancy a long time ago where they did a fire needs assessment for Arkansas. It ended up, when I really later saw what they did, theirs was a little simpler than what we did. They looked at all their federal partners, figured out how much land they have, figured out how much acres they were burning, did some fairly simple arithmetic, wrote up a report, demonstrated that they were burning, tenfold less than they needed to be burning, and it helped them to sort of break out of the mode of thinking they were in and ramp up their programs. And indeed, the acres they started burning with partners went up significantly. And I just thought that was the coolest thing. Data supporting changes on the ground. And so we had started our fire council in Illinois in 2008 into 2009. And it wasn't until 2015, 2016 that we worked on this fire needs assessment. What really brought it together, I had this idea and I wanted to do it, but I never had time to do it. And I had this young man, Mike Saxton, who'd been working for me building fence and doing stewardship, but he was also talented in other ways. And I asked him, I extended his season essentially. So for January and February, this one winter, we worked on this assessment. And it was the first time I think any state had taken not only what acres do we own, but how many acres are we burning in this 1 year? And we took that data and we worked it into our assessment. So if you, I'll show you here on the website, when you open up the homepage, you just scroll down and right here is the Illinois Fire Needs Assessment. And there's an executive summary page that shows up for that. Hold on a second. That would be, so right on here. So there's an executive summary page, which was our bullet points. We worked on that for a long time, the language in this. We wanted it to be compelling. And you can download the entire fire needs assessment report right there. That's the one we did several years back. But let me tell you what the good part about the assessment was that we had the amount of acres that each agency owned roughly, and we had the amount of acres they burned that year. And you could say that Department of Natural Resources owns, say, 50,000 acres and they had burned 5,000 acres. And you could do some math. And if you figured out what fire return interval you wanted for prairies and woodlands and wetlands, you could figure out what percent should they burn in a particular year based on that fire return interval. And what we saw was that agencies generally were not able to meet those goals. And we kind of expected that. What the important thing is, what we didn't know is where were these burns? Where did they occur on the landscape? And wouldn't it be cool if we could have the polygons of each burn on a map of Illinois? And we kicked this around, and one day I'm on a phone call with a colleague, Aaron Lang, and he says, this Dave Holman has produced he's put on a map of Illinois all of the ownerships of conservation lands across the state of Illinois. And I had seen that map and thought, yeah, that's really cool. But then we just realized, well, there's the map. That's the base map we're going to use. And we called up Dave, and he was very open to this. So I'm going to show you that map. So here's Illinois. And if I go down here and click on the protected lands layer, so it populates. That protected lands layer was a lot of work for Dave to produce. So he's got in here everything: park districts, forest preserves, conservation districts, DNR, fish and wildlife. And he often has the land ownership in better detail than the agencies themselves have. Dave's quite a whiz with this. So here, for instance, I'm honing in on my project area in the Chusa grasslands. It's here in the center. And so what we asked for people, would you give us your polygons? And it was that first year. So if I click off some of these years, now the first year the map kind of looked like this, and different agencies were giving us their data. And if I click off the protected land, you see underneath that are what was burned for that first year. Here's Lake County, if you know them, in the top of Illinois. And then the second year and the third year and the fourth, and now we're working on this year's data. So when you have data like this, it's really powerful because you can see what people are burning, and you can see what they're not burning. You can look at, you could compare a soils map to, you can compare a soils map to the burns that have been done. You could look at Illinois nature preserves across the state, or the natural areas inventory that we did in the 70s and early 80s, and you can see how much of that are we keeping up with on fire. How much of oak woods versus prairies. And we have researchers starting to ask us for this data. And we have a policy for sharing data like this. And the power of it is that it shows us across the state as one community of people putting fire on the ground. And we work to talk about this Fires Accomplished map as a community of people. And we want to encourage fire. And now we have the data to show what we're doing and what we want to do with prescribed fire. Now I'm thinking I may have just covered it. It didn't take very long. And you don't have questions at the moment. So maybe I'll just pass on and wait for the panel and see what those discussions lead towards.
Yeah, that sounds good, Bill. Thank you for that. And we'll pass it off to Tracy here if she's ready.
I'll unshare my screen. Stand by.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Stop share. There you go.
All right. So give me just a second to pull up the PowerPoint. I had it up a minute ago and now, of course, I can't find it, right? There we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk about what we did in Wisconsin and a couple of things that I'll throw out. So my name is Tracy Hmielowski. I worked on this when I was working with the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium. We did the bulk of this with the consortium in 2014. Had a paper published in 2016. And then I left my position with the consortium. And so, looking back on this 6 years later, it's been kind of interesting, but I had a moment when I was putting this together the other day where I was like, hopefully this isn't horribly out of date because I've moved on to other things. I'm going back to the resources that I used then. I did see, I was kind of scanning through the participants. I saw we do have a couple of people who are involved in the consortium and in Wisconsin, who might be able to later on help me out when I'm like, hey, like, I don't know if there are any updates on this, because I teach at a community college now. I'm not involved with fire anymore. But what I want to talk with everybody about today is the approach that we used in Wisconsin. Some of you have probably read the paper, maybe you've seen presentations, maybe you've seen the fact sheet, you've seen this in some form, but giving you a sense of, why we did what we did. Because as you're going into this and planning, like, you're going to encounter some of the same issues. Looking back, some of the pros and cons, like hindsight is a great thing. And I can kind of do the Monday morning quarterbacking now of like, well, we should have done this, we should have done that, I wish we'd done this. I think that's something that's really valuable too for a group that's starting out and thinking of doing this in Minnesota. And I can give you a quick summary of costs and time. That's something that everybody's really interested in. And so I went through and found some numbers. Got some ballpark estimates for you. And as I go through this, I'm going to kind of be talking about like we a lot, right? Like we did this, we decided that. This is the we part of it, right? This is not something that I did alone. We had an amazing kind of technical team of people that we worked with, our GIS experts, fire experts, people who are involved with land fire and really knew the data. In addition to that kind of core group that was doing the nuts and bolts of it, we had a group of stakeholders and experts, representatives from the Wisconsin DNR, Fish and Wildlife, the Nature Conservancy, the Forest Service, Land Fire, the consortia. Getting everybody's input in this was critical and valuable and really made it what it was. And I go through and I say, we made the decision to do something. It's a really big we, it's a big group. So we, this big group, right, started out with a relatively simple question. We're saying, okay, how much prescribed fire do we need and where? There had been some attempts at getting some of this data. Bill mentioned that this is like, there are a lot of people who are thinking like, where can we burn? How much can we burn? How much are we burning? And so that was that core starting question of like, okay, like how much do we need? Where do we need it in this state? And before we even like put together any of the maps, we said, all right, like, how are we going to do this? What is this going to look like? What is this project? And there are some critical decisions that we made kind of before we got to the mapping stage. And that influences the end maps, right? And we said, okay, as the consortium, which is representative of some part of 10 states in the upper Midwest, we want to create something that any of these states could essentially replicate. We used Wisconsin as a model, but we used publicly available data that all of these other states could have access to. So essentially somebody could like take this off the shelf and do it for another state. We really focused on ecosystems as opposed to looking at, public lands versus private lands, stuff like that. We said, all right, let's look at ecosystems, let's look at vegetation. Let's not worry about the ownership part of it. Our goal was to have a simple, flexible model, recognizing that needs are going to vary. So again, you have all this publicly available data, you have potentially other states or other agencies that want to use this. We wanted to build something that wasn't so complex that people couldn't make changes. So we kept it relatively simple. And there are times where people are like, why didn't you use this? Why didn't you use that? Why didn't you incorporate another piece? And it's like, well, you could do that. We chose not to. We kept it pretty simple and focused on ecosystems and vegetation as a starting point. We also really consciously said, let's not put money in this. I feel like once you're trying to talk about like, how much does it cost to burn? That can get really sticky, especially with like multiple agencies, private contractors, private landowners. We said, let's not talk about money. Let's stay away from that for everybody's benefit. So when we start with the vegetation layer, we said, all right, we're pulling land fire data because that's something that is publicly available. Everybody's got access to it. And we've got some fire return interval data and these natural communities that are built in, all right? We decided to exclude anything that had a really long fire return interval. We said, if it's over 50 years, let's not worry about that in this initial analysis. Let's focus on the stuff that we've got to deal with, like in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. For Wisconsin, within this vegetation layer, we included managed grasslands. We included pasture. We said, okay, these are areas that they can actually be of some importance. So we're going to keep it in. Not everybody would want to do that. So when we look at just that vegetation layer for land fire, right? Here, I'm going to pull up a pen. There's a lot of Wisconsin that has a really long fire return interval. All of that green is stuff that we excluded. So when we look at the vegetation for the analysis, we get this big hole up here, right? And again, we were saying, all right, you know, fire is important in these systems, but those really long fire return intervals, those ecosystems, we handle them in a slightly different way. And so let's exclude that and set it aside for what we're doing right here and right now. So just based on this layer, right, we can get that kind of quick and dirty back of the envelope calculation and in terms of needs. So when you look at this map, at this point in time, what we pulled in 2014, we said, okay, if you're gonna maintain that map, right? We're not talking about restoration. We are not talking about changing fire return intervals. We're just saying you gotta keep what you got. We get some really big numbers. I think what is most interesting here, right? If we kick out that managed grasslands, we say, okay, let's not worry about pasture right now. We come up with this estimate of 450,000 acres a year to burn. That's a really big number. It's a really valuable number to get people to say, like, we're not doing enough. We have so much more that we can do. We have much more we need to do, especially when you start comparing it with estimates. And I mean, these are some really outdated estimates. This was what I could find. Folks in Wisconsin might have better numbers now, but right, like the high end here is like 50,000 acres. Way off from that need that we have calculated. So this right here is a pretty valuable thing to give people, to say, like, you can make a case that you need more fire in this state just to maintain the ecosystems that you have. But this big scary number, it also means that we gotta acknowledge we can't necessarily do everything, right? And when you start then saying, well, what are the priorities? Where are the places that have the greatest need? That gets a little tricky. Every agency has different priorities. Every person has different priorities, right? Like different groups have different priority areas. And, you know, not everybody wants to save the cats. So how do you create something that can say, well, here are some priority areas based on these criteria, but also creating this product again so that it was flexible, so that somebody with different priorities could go in and look at this in a different way. To get at the priority areas, we kind of borrowed a little bit from economics. And I mean, this is done in conservation all the time, where we do these cost benefit analyses. We said, all right, let's go back to those ecological communities. Where are the ecological benefits the greatest? What's the feasibility of using prescribed fire? You know, we have to acknowledge the fact that it's not always easy to put fire on the ground. And then our denominator in this equation is supposed to be the cost. But remember, we want to avoid using actual dollar amounts. So we had to come up with a different metric for the cost. So when we modified this, right, for the spatial data that we had, ecological communities, we come up with the benefits being heavily weighted towards our ecological benefits. Our challenges or feasibility, we built an index, or we created an index that we used as what we call our challenge index to say like, this is a way to kind of parse out places that are relatively easy to burn from those that are more difficult or more challenging. People might look at our challenge in a different way, in a different context. Folks might have other challenges that they face, right? This is something that you could change if you needed to. And then instead of using actual dollar amounts, we've had our effort index. So I'll go through each of these. I'm not really going to get that deep into the math. If you have really detailed questions, get in touch with me about it. I'll send you the paper, whatever it might be. Oh, and just a note, when I show you these maps, most of the time, you're going to see the summary units as these Huck 12s, so sub-watershed units. We did this instead of counties because it's a little more fine-grained than like a county level. But it's not so fine-grained that you're getting down to like pixel by pixel, acre by acre, being able to zoom in and say like what's happening on any individual property, right? So kind of finding a little bit of a balance where you can zoom in a little bit, but not too much. So benefits, those ecological benefits, we use the existing wildlife action plan. We said, hey, Wisconsin already has priority areas for conservation. They have priority areas for, managing these ecosystems. Burning in those areas is going to be a priority. Maybe those can float to the top. But within the wildlife action plan, we wanted to be able to weight things based on the rarity of the communities. So we also incorporated the natural heritage inventory rankings so that, these critically imperiled ecosystems, the stuff that we are really, really concerned about managing, that got like a bonus point, right? In terms of the weighting. If it's in the wildlife action plan area, and it's a habitat that is imperiled or critically imperiled, like that's got to come to the top as a priority. So we combine these, right? And put it in our summary units. And the greater benefit here, this greatest ecological benefit, is going to be the darker colors. We get a few spots that pop out. So we get the Central Sands and the Northwest Barrens. We got some stuff in Southern Wisconsin. You'll notice that, right, like there's nothing up here because we're not dealing with that vegetation. You got to remember that data that we're dealing with, that hole, when you look at these maps, it's because we've excluded those really long fire return intervals. So this gives us a starting point where it's like, all right, so here are some places we're really concerned with. They're fire dependent ecosystems. They're high priorities for a bunch of reasons. If we've got to pick and choose the acres to burn, here are some places to look. To say how challenging is it or how feasible is it to burn within these areas, what we ended up using was the wildland urban interface layer. And a couple of reasons for this, right? Burning in areas, right, like this, where you've got that interface, it is a little more challenging. And the other thing was that we had another really great publicly available data set that already mapped out all the WUI in the US. So we didn't want to have that Wisconsin specific data that was really difficult for people to replicate. Whether you're in Iowa or Missouri or Texas or wherever, like you could pull this same layer and use this same approach with minimal, changes on your part. Putting that into our summary units, dark colors here are going to be a higher challenge. So, we get these spots that pop out. You'll notice that some of those overlap with the places that came up as having a high ecological benefit. We'll put it all together later. Our denominator, our cost, this is where we said we're not going to have dollars involved, but we need to account for cost in some way. And so we developed our effort index, and that way we could stay away from, the actual dollar amounts. And we said, okay, let's base this on fire return interval and patchiness. And if you think about this, right, like for a given area, how many times do you have to go out and burn? If you've got something with a really frequent fire return interval, you got to go there more often, right? Like in the next 50 years, you might have to go there 20 times. So that's going to be a greater effort. Smaller patches, we said, well, those are kind of a greater effort because, you know, you got to get your crew out there, you got to prep it. You know, you might only have a day per patch, right? Depending upon how distributed things are, like whether or not you can do 2 in a day. Maybe you're only doing 1 in a day. It's not to say that like this is the best way to handle kind of a cost without having a dollar amount attached to it. But when we talked to the stakeholders and when we thought through it, we were like, well, you know, this is kind of a fair assessment of how many times you have to get there and take an action. The more times you have to go, then the more effort there is. And it's not that places with a high effort should sink to the bottom of the priority list. But, you know, if you have a really high effort versus like a medium effort, and then the benefits are very different or similar, you know, that might change where things fall in the priority rankings. When you look at that effort index on this map, right, like all of our patchy, frequently burned places in the southern part of the state are going to pop out as having a greater effort. So we get these terms, setting it up as that cost benefit analysis, right? Or now we're going to put it all together. So I already showed you that map of the greatest ecological benefit, right? Where you're just focusing on rarity, wildlife action plan. These are the places that we really like have already kind of said are super important to manage. Then we kind of weight that based on the challenge of using prescribed fire and the effort that goes into burning those places. We call that this comprehensive ranking. And so, right, this is the map that like everybody sees, and it's ended up on all of the documentation, and you might be familiar with if you are familiar with this project to some extent, right? It's this map where we said, here's our comprehensive ranking. Here are the regions in the state where you kind of get the most benefit with, not to say the least effort, but you know, it's weighted by effort. And we get that Northwest Barrens, Central Sands, you know, we have some spots that pop out. We lose everything where we have long fire return intervals because we don't have that vegetation. But this is kind of what we rolled out to say, like, here are some places to focus on. And here's a starting point for folks to have a conversation and to think about things. So I feel like, you know, on that planning side, right, the folks who are in that technical team, what we really hoped folks would do, and still hope people are doing with this, that they could use this analysis and they could use these maps, because maps as a visual are really, really powerful, to say there is a need for prescribed fire in this state, and there is a need for more prescribed fire in this state. You get some baseline numbers. I mean, you could do a really nice gap analysis. If you focus down on perhaps a specific region, looking at the potential burnable acres versus what's being burned, right? Getting that data that Bill has, where like now he's got folks contributing and they can look at like how much are they really burning? That's something that you could do with this. We also saw a lot of potential to modify these models. Like I said, we wanted something that was simple and flexible, incorporating threatened and endangered species, looking at this through the lens of restoration, right? Those places where you actually have to increase the fire return interval to meet your goals, that's a slightly different analysis. That changes the terms that you put into this. Targeting areas for fuel reduction. So we said that the WUI was a challenge. Maybe that's your priority. Firewise community outreach, like you can look at this in so many different ways. And we also said, like, here's a starting point. Maybe you can replicate this in other locations. Another state could pick this up. Another region could pick this up, whatever it might be. What has been done with this? I had some inquiries from folks in the DNR and meetings, and this was like 2016, 2017. Like I said, I'm in a different state now. I'm in a very different role. I'm obviously not that hard to track down because they got me here today, but I'm less involved in this community now. And so, the time that I can contribute to this as like question and answer is maybe a little more limited. And I don't know if folks just feel like they can't reach out to me. The data set that we have that's associated with this is all of the maps and all of the code, like all the GIS information. That's been downloaded 90 times. I'm not really sure what's happened with it. The paper's been cited 4 times. And this is where, right, like me being out of the loop might kind of influence my perception of it, but I'm not really sure what's been done with this in a lot of ways, right? It's like, I hope that folks are using it, but I'm not necessarily seeing that in the position that I'm in now. So in hindsight, like what went well and what maybe, not to say it didn't go well, but like what are the things we could change? I'd say the things we did really well, we had one person who was focused on this project to keep it moving. This was like a big goal for me to accomplish as a postdoc with the consortium. And so I was that person who kept it going down the road, right? For the consortium to do this as a neutral organizer, I think it limits bias or even the perception of bias. The consortium doesn't actively manage any land. So obviously we weren't prioritizing something for ourselves. We were trying to bring partners together and say, like, what are your shared goals? What are the things that we need to consider? And what do you need in this product? And another great thing, we got a peer-reviewed publication out of this, and we've archived all the code and the data. If this had been something that like we did in a way that it was just an internal document that we shared, it may not be found, it may not be as widely used, right? The cons. Well, we finished the project. And I know it seems weird to have this in the con side, right? Like, this is a great thing, pat ourselves on the back, like we did it. But once you've kind of finished something and, the main contact, who was me, moved on, I think it kind of lost a little bit of its steam. I know that there are folks who are still like, they're pushing this, right? And they bring it up. But you don't have like kind of the cheerleader who's out there promoting this all the time anymore. I think what we saw as a starting point, some people might receive as an end result, right? Like they see the maps and they see the analysis and they're like, yeah, okay, cool. Like maybe we can use that. They don't understand that they can really get into it and modify it and make those changes. And I mean, granted, it takes like having somebody who's really skilled at the GIS to be able to get in there and make those modifications. So that might be something that like, we might have just failed in the marketing a little bit there. And we also didn't really have a formal plan for like updating and reviewing use. I know that the consortium is probably trying to keep track of this on some level, but we didn't really build it in. It wasn't like, hey, in 3 years, let's get our stakeholders together again and talk about this. In 5 years, let's do this. And so, kind of, we didn't want this to be something that got shelved. But not having that nice formal plan of like, how are we going to revisit this and make sure that it's being utilized, I think leads it to kind of, it's something that gets a little bit archived in some ways. And so, my big takeaways, and I guess my advice in looking at this again, right, like 5 years later when I'm like, what happened with that project? Building a living product, right? I love seeing what Bill's got, where it's like people are contributing, they are updating their data, they feel like they're involved, and it's something that's like, it's changing all the time. Having that kind of dynamic product is, I think, a way to keep people involved. Having a way to evaluate the use, like, I mean, everybody hates record keeping, but finding ways to really like look at how it's being used, who's using it, keeping track of it. Like, I think it's something that you got to think about. And then really, you know, having a formal plan to revisit the project, you know, build it in there. I was thinking about this where, you know, I teach like environmental science and we talk about restoration, and that idea of like restoration isn't just that we like cut down the trees and put in the prairie seed and are like, we're done. We have to think about the long-term management of sites. And I think the long-term management of projects is kind of a similar approach where got to think about going back and revisiting this stuff. Cost and time. Just to give you guys some ballpark estimates, right? I was hired as a postdoc. Postdocs are, you know, probably less expensive than some other positions. Annual salary of like $40,000, the benefits and overhead. This is the majority of my time for a year. The consulting work, so the really heavy lifting of the GIS work, which was like the code, 4 to 6 weeks of work. Granted, this was spread out over like 9 months. $10,000 to $12,000 in terms of like the payment that we made for that work to be done. Now, we kind of paid it forward because the code is available as part of the data archive. So if somebody were going to like lift a piece of this, you know, this bit may not be as expensive to accomplish. Thinking about our partner contributions, I can't even give you a dollar amount on that. We had 3 big stakeholder meetings. We got people involved early. I had a lot of people that I was in contact with throughout this project for one-on-one meetings. You know, I spent an afternoon with somebody going through like how to match up the land fire communities and the natural heritage inventory, because not all of the community types were the same. You know, we had a lot of partner contributions and just in-kind time that went into this. And so, you know, I can't put a dollar amount on that for you guys. I can't even give you an hour estimate on it, but it was huge. Like, it was not insignificant. If you've got really detailed questions, I know we're going to obviously have time for questions, this roundtable discussion, but if there are questions that go beyond that, I know that there's some additional documentation on the Tallgrass Consortium website. There might be some stuff on the Lake States website too. Jack would know better than I do, and I didn't check out your website, I'm sorry. If you wanted the ecological applications paper, which is behind a paywall, if you don't have a subscription, email me and I can get you a PDF. And I can also send you the link to the data set, which is archived through Dryad. So feel free to just shoot me an email about that if it's something that like you want the paper, you want access to the data. We can make that happen for you.
Folks, I'll jump in here. Trace, that's a good point. We cannot put that on the website since it is a closed access. So we can put the link to it, but if people have a paid subscription, they can get it. So the best option is to contact you direct as the lead author.
Yeah, so like we can't post the paper, but I as the main author on the paper have a PDF and nobody can stop me from emailing it to you.
We do have, you know, we do have your cheat sheets and other stuff, and I do put your contact information in the email or in the chat box, excuse me. And we'll condense all this into a summary. We can make that available on both the websites.
Yeah.
For folks.
And so, Jack, you're probably monitoring the chat box. I got like the little notification that people had entered stuff. I don't know if there were specific questions for me. I mean, we could always address that when we have time for questions, unless it were something that was like really pressing.
So Mike Lynch will be coordinating the questions during the panel.
Okay. All right, so I've got my screen share off so that we can move on to our next presenter. But thanks everybody. I've got to say, like, I'm super excited that Jack contacted me about this and that, you know, Minnesota is working on this, because these products are super valuable in whatever form they take. And for like all these agencies to be thinking about it and working together and like having this kind of desire for a product, really excited to hear that. So I appreciate you guys getting in touch with me today.
Thank you very much, Tracy. We appreciate your time and insight this morning with us, and to continue the conversation with partners, even after moving on to different things. So we appreciate that. All right, Josh, take it away.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to participate. As my presentation loads up, I was hoping Jack might jump in and take a couple minutes and talk about the actual first fire needs assessment that occurred in Michigan back in 2008 when he was part of the Nature Conservancy.
Sure. I'm entering the chat box. So as Josh referenced, there was an older version of the fire needs assessment that I helped coordinate with Michigan Nature Conservancy when I was there. And it was a very coarse filter. And one of the things that we realized from it is a lot of gaps in information and determining where there's gaps in data sets. We did use Landfire as one of the options, and it was the older version of Landfire. And it did give us some big numbers, kind of like Tracy pointed out. The numbers that you come up with are pretty shocking, but at least it gives you a high bar. And the partners used a lot of that to help prioritize where they should be focusing more on burns. So that has not been updated, and it was kind of interesting. Tracy pointed out a lot of the similarities in that product. Once it was done, folks thought it was done, and it was hard to kind of get a revival for updates and so on. So that's one of the lessons learned is, these need to be living documents. And as people retire and move on, you need to make sure they're living documents for the new folks coming in so that there's not a recreation of that kind of thing. And then, I was really pleasantly surprised to see or to be contacted by Josh when Josh, you started doing this, to see this kind of revival and a much finer detail attempt and a much more robust data sets that you could use.
So I'm working from home like most of you are. I've got teenagers in school online right now. So I may be a little spotty, so I'm gonna kill my video as I present. Also, let me know if my audio is not working well. But thanks again, Jack and Paul, for inviting me to participate in this discussion. The timing is great in that I've been working with my colleagues, Clay Wilton, Helen Nenander, and Tyler Bassett to continue working on our prescribed fire needs assessment for state lands in Michigan. But we're also working up a manuscript to submit. And so this is very fresh on our minds. Another thing I'll point out is that I believe my co-authors are on this Zoom as well. So if there are questions that come up that you need immediate answers to, they may be able to provide those answers in the chat. So as Jack mentioned, this fire needs assessment was the second one done in Michigan, and coming in after Jack and then also Tracy and Bill, we had the benefit of seeing what other states and other folks had done in terms of fire needs assessment. So I'll provide a quick introduction, give you a flavor of what fire looks like in Michigan, why we need it in terms of what are our fire dependent systems, how they're threatened by fire suppression, what are the benefits of fire in those systems. But I'll move through that quickly. Like most Great Lakes states, we're seeing drastic losses in fire dependent ecosystems and the species that depend on them. Increases in mesophytic species in the understories of pine and oak forests, regeneration failure of oaks and pines, and an overall reduction in species and habitat diversity. One of the most drastic changes we've seen in Michigan is the loss through habitat fragmentation and fire suppression of barrens, prairies, and savannas. We're down to less than 0.0, let me get this right, 0.02% left. And as a result of fire suppression, we get waves of invasive species and mesophytic species encroaching on our prairie systems. This is a wall of glossy buckthorn coming in on a Lake Plain wet mesic prairie, one of our critically imperiled systems in Southeast Michigan. So as you know, fire has multiple benefits for these fire-dependent ecosystems: maintaining open structure, fostering regeneration, decreasing cover of invasives and mesophytic species. So when we're thinking about our fire needs model, we're thinking about all of these factors in terms of how fire-dependent systems are impacted at multiple scales and how they're benefited at multiple scales by fire. Just some more pictures to give you a flavor of fire in Michigan. Used to regenerate pine and oak to control invasive species and mesophytic invaders such as red maple. In our fire-dependent wetland systems such as prairie fen, used to knock back invasives like glossy buckthorn. And in our oak savanna or oak pine barrens, in this particular example, used to maintain the open structure and promote diversity of species, graminoids, and forbs as well. So some quick background about this project. We were funded by the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. All of the authors on this paper were part of Michigan's Natural Heritage Program, were conservation scientists in an organization called Michigan Natural Features Inventory. So as I present, bear that in mind. The focus of our modeling effort is on modeling for ecological need of prescribed fire. So we definitely bring our own set of biases and values to this modeling process. So we're modeling the ecological need for prescribed fire on state lands in Michigan. We are not the DNR, and we are not providing the overall assessment of fire need on state lands. A lot of other values would need to go into that type of assessment. But prior to our effort, there was not a systematic way to evaluate the ecological conditions of what I'm going to be calling stands. So in Michigan, we have on state lands we've done wall-to-wall vegetative mapping and through this Michigan Forest Inventory database that I'll talk about. And that's the foundational unit of this model. And so some more background, the DNR recognized that prescribed burns need to be informed more by, to be informed by the best available, the best available ecological information. They wanted us to develop a tool to assess ecological need of prescribed fire at multiple scales. And as I mentioned, coming late in the process, we have the benefit of seeing other efforts. So we're inspired by past fire needs, fire needs assessment efforts. And then the end goal being the implementation of prescribed fire in the ecologically most important places. Our approach was to use a GIS-based multi-criteria decision analysis. It's often also called a weighted geographic overlay. And I'll dive into the methods a little later on, but kind of the general flow of work: review the literature on fire frequency and return intervals for Michigan's ecosystems and key species, classify stands by natural community type and the scale of fire dependence, assign a fire frequency range to each stand, evaluate each stand's need for prescribed fire based on an array of spatial variables, and the presence of fire dependent and fire sensitive species, and develop data files and maps at the stand level attributed with the above ecological information. Ultimately, calculate a fire needs score for each stand. The nice part about this modeling is that we can both evaluate fire need at fine scales, but then aggregate scores. You have a stand, you can look at a grouping of stands. In Michigan, they manage compartments within various management areas. You can keep scaling up to regions. Tracy made some great points that you need to bear in mind when thinking about models. This is, we present maps. That is not the answer. That is not the end result. It's a starting point for discussion. Other things to bear in mind when thinking about modeling is how complex fire is. This is a work in progress. We appreciate input. One thing that we've done throughout the modeling process is we present to stakeholders, present to our project sponsors, present in academic settings, and then get input and then incorporate that input. It's a living process, and that we continue to be funded by the DNR to improve this modeling effort. So I'll get into the nitty-gritty details of our methods now. As I mentioned, the foundational unit are these stands that are part of the Michigan Forest Inventory Database. There's about probably over 180,000 stands within this database now. Average size is 25 acres. Ecologists and botanists within Michigan Natural Features Inventory have been doing wall-to-wall vegetative mapping across southern Michigan on state lands managed by the Wildlife Division of the Department of Natural Resources for the past decade. In northern Michigan, DNR foresters and wildlife biologists have been doing that same type of mapping for the past 2 decades. We've also done about 1/3 of state lands that are managed by the Parks and Recreation Division. So stands, when we map these areas, we assign a cover type, sugar maple association, oak pine, warm season grasses. And then there's also data on the species that are the dominants within the canopy. There's also information about species in subcanopy, understory, and ground cover. So we use these stands, intersect them with spatial data, and evaluated the stand data to generate a crosswalk of stands to natural community type. We use natural community type because we can get at a fire return interval through review of the literature on fire frequency range and fire return intervals. We then group our input variables into submodels. We have a landscape submodel, stand submodel, and species level model. And we score each variable on a score of 0 to 5, with 0 being no need and 5 being the highest need for fire. And for each stand, these multiple input variables were evaluated, scored, and weighted to generate an overall score for ecological need for prescribed fire. So just a reiteration of this process. Each stand, we evaluate its ecological need for prescribed fire based on an array of spatial variables and the presence of fire-dependent and fire-sensitive species. You'll see that we have, I think, 13 input variables. And for each of these variables, we evaluate them, score them, and weight them to generate an overall fire needs score. And this diagram gives you a sense of the variables that we incorporated into our modeling. Landscape variables included physiographic region, circa 1800 vegetation, superficial geology, vegetation condition class or departure from historic disturbance regime, a variable that we got from land fire. Our stand level variables are fire frequency, fire dependence, aspect, slope, whether or not there's a high quality natural community element occurrence that corresponds with the particular stand, what's the stand's age, stand size in terms of whether it is log, pole, or sapling. And then we also evaluated species, both common species within the Michigan Forest Inventory Database and also rare species that are within Michigan Natural Features Inventory's Natural Heritage Database. So for each of these variables, we, for a given stand, came up with a score and then came up with a weighting system for that variable based on our assessment and input from natural resource managers and fire experts on the importance of that variable for determining the ecological need for fire. Sum all of those weighted scores together and you get one fire need score by stand, and then you can display it in GIS using colors to convey the different scoring, zeros being the cool, zero being blue and red being your hottest or highest fire need. And for each of the natural communities within Michigan Natural Features Inventory's classification, we did a literature review to determine the fire frequency range. And our new publication will have a table with those fire frequency ranges and citations. This is an evolving science. So something to bear in mind is that, you know, as we gain better understanding of fire ecology, fire disturbance regimes, these models should change. They should be improved as our ecological understanding of these systems improves over time. Just to give you a sense of what the crosswalk looks like, drove me nuts. I did, you know, a lot of this was manually done to make sure we're getting the right natural community type ascribed to the Michigan Forest Inventory-based stand type to make sure that we're getting the right fire frequency range. Close to 200,000 crosswalks to get at these fire return intervals per stand. And an example of the crosswalk of the community type to the cover type to get to your scale of fire dependence and your fire frequency range. And then for each of the variables, we came up with scoring rules, these if-then statements. If your fire frequency range is 1 to 5 years, then you're going to add a score of 5. And we gave these if-then statements for every variable to our GIS analyst, Helen Anander, and she wrote the script to make the model go. We wanted to incorporate species into our model. So we looked at over 411 species that are part of the Michigan Forest Inventory Database, conducted literature review on fire tolerance and fire dependence. Clay Wilton was leading this effort. And then we classified different species as fire sensitive, desirable natives. For those species, we subtracted for the fire score. There are some invasive species that are fire tolerant. We wanted to make sure we weren't, we were adding commentary to stands where these occurred. We added commentary and stippling. And I'll talk about some of the supplementary types of information we incorporated into our model that's not reflected in our scoring later. But that's one of the things we did for fire tolerant invasives that can increase following prescribed fire, such as narrowleaf cattail. Fire dependent, fire tolerant native species got plus scores added on. For certain systems, we made rules that if you had red maple coming in a dry mesic system, for example, you'd add on to a fire score. So those are our fire sensitive, invasive, or native species. And then we also wanted to convey that there are certain invasive species that need more than just one fire. So these are somewhat fire sensitive invasives that may need repeated fire, may need fire during particular times of year, may need fire of a certain intensity. So trying to incorporate the complexity of the thousands of decisions land managers have to make to implement prescribed fire. For our rare species, we looked at 461 rare species that intersected with these stands, came up with similar scoring rules. Fire dependent species that occur in fire dependent habitat getting positive scores, but also wanting to make sure we provide symbology for rare species that might need refugia, insect species that might, that they may have limited habitat in these fire dependent systems. So breaking up a fire into a couple units would be beneficial for them in the long term and also reduce the risk of taking those species. So as I mentioned, this GIS-based multi-criteria decision analysis is the approach that we're taking. The nice thing about this is you can swap in whatever variables you want. As Tracy was mentioning, it's not set in stone what your input variables are, and different stakeholders, with different value systems will likely have different ideas about what are the important things to incorporate into a needs assessment or to go beyond a needs assessment and develop a prioritization. But the nice thing about this approach is it allows you to incorporate multiple input variables with different units of measurement, and you can reclassify those variables onto a common value scale, apply your weights, sum your scores, get your geographic weighted overlay, and then display it in GIS. And this is just to give you a sense of what our a typical scoring might look like for a given stand. It's oak pine barrens in the southwest part of the state. Scores are going up because of the flat aspect, the historical occurrence of oak pine barrens, the current occurrence of a high quality oak pine barrens, the presence of desirable tolerant species, the presence of a tolerant rare species. And so it gets our highest needs score. And to help us evaluate the performance of our model, we created multiple graphics, these panels at multiple scales, created multiple presentations, brought those to stakeholders, brought them to our project sponsors to see how our model was performing, brought them to the actual surveyors who were conducting surveys in these lands, have years and years of on the ground experience within these areas to make sure the model made ecological sense. And so, as I said, the nice thing about this model is you can go from a group of stands to a management area. It's easily scalable. And then another thing that we did was to look at how, when we group our variables into these submodels, how that impacts the model. So we looked at variables grouped by landscape, stand, species submodels to see their influence on the full model. We wanted to compare our modeling results to what's actually going on in terms of prescribed fire in Michigan. Unfortunately, there's currently not a comprehensive spatially explicit prescribed fire database that corresponds to stand data. But we did have access to point data from 2007 to 2020, and also tabular data for a longer time, for a shorter time period, showing area burned by management area from 2016 to 2020. So our results, all the model products that we're deriving are, the main product are these stand level data files attributed with the ecological data. And then we can convey that information through spatial representation of stands at multiple scales, but we can also generate summary graphics and statistics by area of interest. One thing that we are developing, and this gets to Jack and Tracy's point of the importance of making these accessible to people in living documents, and also great to see Bill's kind of live demonstration of their online tool. But we're working towards developing some type of web interface where land managers can access the model and generate maps, pie charts, summary statistics at multiple scales. So I'll go through just kind of the results at multiple scales to show you, what you can do with this type of modeling approach. We have our prescribed fire need scores across the state, and on the right, the distribution of the scores. Highest fire need was found in the southwest part of the state. And you can compare fire needs across the different regions of the state. This is a comparison of the Southwest, the Southeast, the Northern Lower Peninsula, the West UP, and the East UP. And then you can also do this same type analysis for specific management areas. So this is one of the management areas in the Southwest with one of the highest mean fire needs scores for the state. And you can do a similar type of comparison looking at several different management units. This is a comparison of Allegan State Game Area in the Southwest, Port Huron State Game Area in the Southeast, and a forest management unit in the Western Upper Peninsula. As I mentioned, we wanted to include caveats into our modeling, not reflected in our scoring, but reflected in comments in our stand tables, and also in the attributes we assigned in GIS. So glossy buckthorn needs multiple fires. Narrow leaf cattail can increase following fire. Certain rare species live in fire dependent habitats but might need refugia. We have multiple systems that have complex fire regimes. It's not just, this type of fire occurs once. It's you have catastrophic fire or stand replacing fire, but you also have surface fires that are occurring more frequently. And we also wanted to provide, in areas where we have stand replacing fires, to note those systems, because in certain parts of the state where these systems are occurring, the use of prescribed fire to maintain these systems might not be feasible, given societal concerns of proximity to residents, issues like that. So this is how these caveats look when incorporated into the model. For this particular stand, you have a rare species. This is a Karner blue butterfly. The green symbology is telling the manager you might want to establish some refugia. The stippling says there's a species there, invasive species that should be controlled before the implementation of fire. And the cross hatching is saying you're going to need multiple burns, or a specific type of burn, or additional treatment to control that particular species. So some discussion points. This is not a definitive answer. It's a tool to provide managers with information about where and how often to manage with fire. Doesn't replace on the ground expertise, and it's developed to foster informed discussion and facilitate difficult decisions about allocation of finite resources. I'll emphasize once again, our focus is on ecological need. And this model was derived by conservation scientists, and we've got our inherent biases. It's one of many values that natural resource managers evaluate when making prescribed fire decisions. One thing I wanted to dive in a little bit was how is Michigan doing in terms of prescribed fire need as defined by our model and application. So two questions you can ask when looking at this model and the application of fire in Michigan is, are we burning enough and are we burning the right places? So we identified over 10,000 acres that had the highest fire need. Currently, well, over the last 5 years on average, close to 5,500 acres are burning. If we look in Southwest Michigan, close to 7,000 acres identified as the highest fire need. Over the past 5 years, just over 1,000 acres being burned. If we look at a comparison of fire need and application, and we've done this in a relative way, the highest relative need for prescribed fire is in the Southwest, but the application of fire is higher in other regions of the state. So to reiterate, the greatest need for fire is in the Southwest region, but prescribed fire is not being applied in proportion with that need. So as Bill was alluding to, you can come up with kind of through simple calculation how much you should be burning based on your fire return intervals. So you can determine your target acreage to burn. And if we were looking at just the highest, very high, and high classes per year, you can look at the corresponding area for each class by its corresponding fire frequency range. Looking at those types of breakdowns, our model suggests that burn rates should be 1.7 to 10.7 times higher. Within the Southwest region, we should be 2.6 to 6 times higher. So we also wanted to look at where things were burning in relation to kind of the fire mean scores of management areas. So these two different statistical analyses here show on the left, we looked at the fire mean scores of burned areas and the fire mean scores of areas that were not burned, and they were not statistically different. So we would hope that there would be a difference, but based on the data that we have and kind of what we've been modeling, there was not a difference from those areas. And then on the right, among areas that were burned, burn frequency increased slightly, just slightly, with increasing fire mean scores, but only accounted for 7% of the variation in prescribed fire frequency. So these graphics bring up the point of why are certain areas burning and certain areas not burning. And we generated a table to kind of look at that, looking at the past decade, where we had high fire mean scores in areas that did not burn. These are in yellow, and I'm suggesting that they're fire gaps, but there's also areas that had very low fire mean scores based on our model, and were burning greater than 10 times in the last decade. So these are potentially fire sinks, according to our model. So limitations, I've emphasized this throughout. It's a tool to provide resource managers with information about ecological need of stands for prescribed fire. It's just state lands. It does not provide information about requisite seasonality and severity. It doesn't classify stands as needing restoration or maintenance fires, and it doesn't provide site-specific detail about the required frequency of prescribed fire in fire-suppressed stands and fire-suppressed landscapes. As I mentioned earlier, our understanding of fire ecology, fire disturbance regimes, and fire return intervals is continually evolving. And this, the nice thing about this type of modeling is that as our understanding changes, we can improve models. Our foundational unit is this Michigan Forest Inventory database. There are multiple surveyors contributing to this database. And variable quality and detail. Evaluating the model would be, we could do a better job of evaluating the model and how need and application are related if we had spatially and temporally explicit databases of past prescribed fire. And then, another key point is that the input variables and their corresponding weights were derived by our expert assessment. That said, literature review, conversations with natural resource managers and fire ecology experts went into that evaluation. Going forward, we continue to incorporate input. We're starting to develop the tool across Michigan, not just for state lands. We're developing models for priority, where we look at rarity, integrity, and resiliency at multiple scales, but also efficiency and considering incorporating ecosystem services. If there's time, I can kind of show you the graphic of that model. Like Tracy was doing, we're trying to incorporate feasibility. And then, as I mentioned, to make this more accessible to our targeted audience, we're developing not just a handbook, but a user-friendly GIS interface. This, just to give you a sense of our approach for the statewide effort, we're using land fire, using a subset of our input variables and using hexagons, 640 acres in size, to generate this same type of fire needs assessment, but a much coarser evaluation. So some quick conclusions. The model integrates both fine scale, field collected, and broad scale GIS data to characterize fire needs across state lands. These needs are geographically variable at multiple scales. And across the state, fire needs increase with decreasing latitude and are highest in the Southwest. The model, we think, is useful in terms of identifying regional patterns of fire needs that can then inform broad scale planning. It can highlight specific sites in need of fire management and thereby direct on the ground implementation of prescribed fire. And it can also illustrate disparity of ecological need for fire and actual application. By looking at these fire gaps and fire sinks, we can perhaps enlighten policymakers tasked with funding and structuring burning programs. A lot of people to thank. Sponsors for the project included folks in the Michigan DNR, Mark Sargent, Chris Hoving, Mike Donovan, and also thankful for the input from Glenn Palmgren, who works with the Forest Resource Division and is the fire management specialist. And then our emails are here. If you would like to contact us about specifics, and if there are questions that we're not able to address in the discussion section. I will quickly move to just show you this is our approach for our priority model and the variables that we're incorporating into that. We're looking at prioritizing by looking at integrity at multiple scales, looking at landscape factors, as well as stand level factors, looking at rarity. We're incorporating resiliency by looking at TNC's climate modeling. We incorporate efficiency by looking at aggregations of stands with high fire need in these areas where you can have neighborhoods. And then, as I mentioned, we're also looking at incorporating ecosystem services into this process. But with that, I will turn it back over and thank you all for your time. Sorry, can't be there in person to see y'all, but appreciate the opportunity to present.
All right. Thank you very much, Josh. Appreciate that wonderful presentation, and to everybody. Looking at the clock here, let's get a 10 to 15 minute break, and let's be back at 10:40, and we'll jump into the question and answers hosted by Mike. Thanks, everybody. All right, welcome back, everybody. Everybody had a chance to fill their coffees and refresh themselves for question and answer session. I'm just going to pass it over to Mike, who's going to moderate our questions to our presenters. So take it away, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Terrific presentations here by Bill, Tracy, and Josh. I really appreciate seeing the kind of diversity of approaches here and diversity of outputs. We've got a number of questions that have come in so far, so that's great. We'll kind of go through a few of these, and I encourage everyone to, continue to put in questions in the chat window. We'll try and get through kind of what we can here on the chat window, and certainly we can pick these up again after the fact. But and not only, as I wrote a few minutes ago here, don't only think of questions for the presenters. We certainly want to do that while we've got them on here today, but also thinking from a Minnesota perspective, or if you're in a different state, I suppose that as well. But just what would you like to see out of a new Minnesota product, and how would you use it? What information would be most useful? Things like that, I think would be great for kind of kicking off this group discussion. One of our first questions that came in was for Bill, and I'd like to reread the question, at least in brief here, and then ask for some feedback from Bill, and if any of the other presenters after that have some feedback as well. So the first question here was, do any of you have a suggestion on how to encourage agencies, NGOs, and private individuals to take the time to compile and share their burned polygons? This was something that was highlighted in the later presentations as well. And did you have good participation and response? How did you gather the shape files, etc.?
This is Bill. So that's a key part of this, is having your agencies wanting to share their data. And we weren't sure how people, when we first thought of the idea, whether people were going to want to share their data. But we were pleasantly surprised that most were willing. It took some, and every year, we're on about our fifth year now. Every year we have to remind, prod, encourage some agencies to submit their data. But basically you reach out to a person is the trick, not a group email. You contact that person that you know that has access to the data and have a conversation with them. And if you can get them to give you that data the first time, the second time will likely be better. All the major agencies, county, state, and feds shared their polygons. So that made the map go.
Well, great. Yeah, I think that's a tremendous, project to try and get all of that stuff compiled, but that certainly sounded like a limitation that Wisconsin and Michigan had identified with their products as well. Let's see, let's grab one of these here. We have a comment from Travis that says, glad to hear you mention the idea of looking for other benefits like fuels reduction. Tremendous amount of social benefit may be possible that may otherwise be lost by a heavily ecological benefit approach. And so I think this kind of goes towards all three of our presenters. Maybe we'll start with Tracy on this one, and certainly we can jump to Josh and Bill on that. But what are your thoughts on the idea of focusing on ecological versus, as Travis emailed us a little while back when we first were putting some of this information out, about trying to tie in, social and economic, whether it be fuels reduction, your urban interface for the social, or kind of oak regeneration as an economic component as well. Thoughts on that, Tracy?
Yeah, I think that the focus on the ecological component and really focusing on ecological benefits for us, right, was that when you get everybody in a room together, that's one thing they can all agree on, right? Like, it's, if you're talking about why do we need fire, why do we use fire, maintaining fire dependent ecosystems is always like in the top two. And when you start to talk about like burning for, you know, timber or fuel reduction or other reasons that are still very, very valid and are still a lot of priorities for different agencies, that's where it starts to get trickier, because it's like, well, we do that here, but we don't do it here. That matters to this agency, but not so much to our private landowners. That matters to these people, but not these people. And trying to get like all of that nuance into a statewide assessment for us was just like, it would have been kind of on the next step, right? For somebody to take it and look at it through that lens. Whereas for us, for the starting point, it was like, all right, we can all agree on the ecology. So let's focus on the ecology as a starting point.
Our Illinois fires accomplished map can be sliced and diced for different questions that people can answer using all those different polygons and years. And we expect over time that people will use that data in different ways. And we think that's a good thing. So we've had a few researchers approach us. A recent one wants to look at important natural areas, insects in those natural areas, and then the fire frequency those areas have had. And they want to, you know, get access to our polygons over the years, and we were able to give them that relatively easily.
I would just reiterate that, you know, it's a starting point. It's not the complete picture. And from my perspective, you know, I was contracted by the Michigan Department of Natural Resources Wildlife Division to provide that ecological perspective. My expertise is not on the different societal and economic values that go into fire. You know, that in my mind, that, you know, here's a product that we provide the DNR and they can use it as they, you know, as they see fit. They can incorporate those other values. We tried to create a framework where, you know, by using this GIS-based multi-criteria decision analysis, other variables can easily be incorporated. Variables can be dropped, weights can be changed. You know, that kind of input changes based on your value system. So that's why we took the approach we did in Michigan. But as an ecologist, I think you have to know what's going on with your ecosystems before you can make informed decisions that factor in those other inputs. And what is critical in all of our models is that evaluation of what's the appropriate fire return interval to get us a sense of where we are in terms of how far are we off in terms of application based on that ecological need. So I think in my perspective, it's, you know, it provides the great starting point that can then help inform very complicated decisions that, as Tracy mentioned, you know, those decisions are going to vary based on what your, you know, who the landowner is and what their various interests are.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. And that was one of the unique things between, yeah, certainly Josh's product focused on DNR state lands in Michigan versus some of these other ones that had a broader focus. I think I actually want to skip ahead to one that was posted just recently here that is kind of for all presenters, I guess. Maybe we'll start with Josh and we can work back since we just ended with Josh. And that is from Daniel Godwin that says, I'm curious how each presenter thinks their product could be best tailored for and presented to policymakers and practitioners.
Sorry. So we've been presenting to resource managers at various scales, ranging from field offices in, for example, the Southwest or the Northern Lower Peninsula. But we've also presented to kind of the management team of the DNR that's centrally located in Lansing. And I mean, what's key is to try to, have like what Bill has, kind of some executive summary type information summarized. Here's what we did. This is why it's important. This is what you can learn from this information. I'm outside of the DNR, so it's here's information we're providing you. You need to make, use that as you wish. But the key is, some simple points, a couple bullets, and some great maps to convey what your needs assessment is showing in terms of, in my perspective, what the key points can be are, is there a disparity between the needs and application? And is there a disparity between the places we're identifying as critical and where burns are occurring? And if that's the case, then you can ask, those decision makers, well, why is that the case?
And Tracy, do you have anything to add? I know you've kind of stepped out of the Wisconsin realm, but you had some good, feedback at the end of your presentation on kind of maybe some lessons learned here and maybe just an idea of how your understanding is that this could have or would have been nice to have been used in that kind of policy making realm.
Yeah, so my personal thought, right, kind of off the cuff here, thinking of policy, is that I could see a couple ways to present this. One, right, if you're looking for additional funding that goes into prescribed fire, like demonstrating that need, the gap between what's being burned versus what like could be burned or needs to be burned to maintain communities, and then the safety aspect of it. So looking at it through the lens of, wild and urban interface in a different way, we use that as, like I said, that kind of feasibility index, but you could probably go through and tweak the model a bit so that your priority areas for action are the areas where you have high fuel loads near homes, right? And saying like, we need to take action because this is a, public safety issue. So like, that's kind of the policy route that I could see as a couple ways to use it. And with practitioners, and bringing it to when I was still with the consortium and, kind of presenting this and talking to folks at the DNR, the thing that we were always really trying to talk about was that flexibility. And, like, here are some ways that you could possibly use this. Here are other things you could incorporate. Here's another way to, other things you can add in. So those ideas of, if you were to look at, say, like a district, right? So north to south in the state, you've got different habitats, different priorities, like almost different agencies in some ways, like within the DNR, to say like, you can take this as like a base and then put your properties in here and put what you know about these properties and develop your own kind of priority rankings within a region, like presenting it to them as more of like a tool as a starting point, as opposed to, like a solution, it's, and that's one thing that we keep repeating over and over again. And I hope that folks in Minnesota, you're hearing it, but really keeping in mind that you never want to show this to somebody and have them think it's the end, because it's really a jumping off point. But it's hard to get people to look at maps and think that they can like change it, like.
If I can jump in, can I in here. Producing and you can use that we're one positive experience. You shared your data with us, and we're celebrating our community of fire practitioners, and that's what the opening statement is about. And then I spent this is our most recent summary. I spent the first few just trying to explain how we produce the map, why it's important. And then I start to look at different agencies, and I ask them for photos, and I show like DuPage County here, forest preserves and what they burned. And I zoom in on one of their sites, and I'm showing the polygons of different years. And then I'm getting photos saying, you know, getting the job done, and photos they sent me. So it's a positive thing. People like to see their crews. And I went on to, you know, here's Cook County Forest Preserves and their people, and DNR and other people and other sites. So it's trying to show that community of people getting fire done on the ground. And then we look at 2014 to 2019 acres burned by agency. So here you see Fire and Forest Preserve District and the amount of acres over the years we have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years of data there. And Cook County Forest Reserves down here. And then we can also look at that by percent acres burned. So we go back to the original number of acres we knew we had for each agency, assume that hasn't changed much, and you can put a percent in there. Byron Forest Preserve keeps being the winner in our data set. They're quite good at getting a lot of fire on the ground, so they get a very high percentage done. And they're quite consistent. And then we show how we got that data. And then we have habits of effective prescribed fire programs, things most of us would agree on. So trying to be positive, trying to be supportive of others as they're doing their good work.
Yeah, that seemed great. I like that, the idea of kind of flowing through and having that follow-up. I suppose another one to jump to, we've kind of hit on this a little earlier with the idea of tying in different risks, but I see a question here from Larry asking, maybe particularly for Minnesota, thinking of how there's been kind of spruce budworm outbreaks in the northern part of the state and a bunch of dying fir trees that present a wildfire risk. And so his question is, how should wildfire risk to communities be addressed in fire needs assessments? Do any of you feel confident? I'm not even sure which one to hand it around. Maybe to Josh, because you guys have maybe some similar situations up in the Upper Peninsula. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, we have high fuels in the Upper Peninsula and also the high plains of Michigan with jack pine. Tracy will have jack pine as an issue in northern Wisconsin as well. I've had discussions with, I've presented to folks with the Forest Service, and one of the first questions I always get is, well, how about rolling in risk? That's not my expertise. We don't have, I don't think, adequate data in our Michigan Forest Inventory data set to incorporate risk. We could probably fudge something, but I would leave that to folks who specialize in that. And like I say, with these types of modeling processes, you can roll in other input variables. I would suggest, if that's a concern, you roll it in. We did try to incorporate, to acknowledge that there are certain systems where you don't, managers don't have fire as part of their toolkit. And so that's, we have, comments in our stand tables and symbology to show where there are stand replacing fires. So that kind of acknowledges that, you might want to consider other types of treatments if fire is not an option. So that's just my take on that.
Unless I see, it doesn't look like Bill or Tracy have unmuted, so maybe you guys didn't have much to add. We can skip to another one here. I kind of going back to one from Ryan O'Connor a little bit earlier, and this one he says is specifically for Josh. He writes, burn unit size is often an important criterion for practitioners. Have you integrated contagion modeling or something similar to give managers and planners a better sense of where efficiency, for example, acres per burn, can be leveraged or improved?
I'm gonna see if our GIS analyst, Helen, is still on the Zoom. So kind of neighborhood effect is something that we have incorporated as a variable in our priority modeling. And then burn, the stand size is another factor. We did experiment with contagion modeling with early iterations of our priority model. Helen, you want to jump in? I see you.
Yeah. So in the priority model, we used neighborhoods for burn unit size. So, all the stands above a prescribed fire score of a certain level. We used the total acreage of all contiguous stands that, met a certain fire score. So I think we also, and also where our invasive species model overlaps. But as far as contiguous stands for the prescribed fire model, there's so much variation in the configuration of stand size that finding a neighborhood that made sense was really difficult. Nearest neighbors or just sharing a boundary. Once you looked at the results, you couldn't find anything that made sense because of the large variation in size and shape of the stands in the database.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for the clarity on that one. And just reiterate that if anyone has any other questions, please, add them to the chat box. Not only just kind of thinking specifically here, addressing the presentations we've seen, but kind of, how can this be useful in Minnesota moving forward as well? We have a couple of questions on kind of spatial-based questions on using different layers. We have one from Jim Manolis regarding TNC's resilient and connected network data. And then one from someone else that asks about the potential for LiDAR products improving modeling. Any follow-up on any of those opportunities?
I can tell you in Michigan for the priority model that we do use the TNC resilience data as one of the variables. We also use it in our invasive prioritization models. So, we have incorporated that data. And LiDAR data on a statewide scale, that would be, I don't have a computer big enough to do that. So it's not an option for us at this point.
So Helen's referring to, we did a similar effort to prioritize invasive species treatment on state lands. So kind of getting to the point that I made earlier, that this type of modeling framework is broadly applicable, can answer multiple types of questions. We're focused on biodiversity stewardship. So that's been kind of the focus of our modeling efforts. But we have looked at, when we're developing multiple models, we incorporate a variable where we look at model overlap to get at efficiency. So where multiple models are pointing to the same place for different reasons, then you can increase the importance of that place.
Yeah, and I see a comment just came in here of our higher resolution maps even needed. So maybe that's a, question there as well, because, and certainly the difference between Michigan had down to field collected data tied in, whereas the Wisconsin analysis was, more on the Huck 12 level, a little bit broader scale. A question we had from earlier that was specifically geared towards Tracy's presentation, but I think could kind of go to everyone's, especially since Tracy articulated that she hasn't been following as closely. And maybe if there's someone else on the phone, you all have the capacity now to unmute. Please don't all unmute at the same time, and it can turn into a mess. But question essentially is, has getting this fire needs assessment contributed to changes in implementation, spatial changes or increases in prescribed fire overall, or any influences on policy changes? Maybe start with Tracy, and then I think this is a good one to just kind of bounce around all sides and reflecting on, as Minnesota is looking towards doing this, what are some things that you saw as effective outcomes, if you have it all?
Yeah, so that idea of like, do you see changes? I mean, at my core, right, I'm a scientist and I like data. And thinking about this in hindsight, it's like, I wish we could have looked for that kind of like, is there an impact of having done this project, right? Like, would this have been something that got utilized, changed how things are done, like changed any kind of, to Bill mentioned that, right, when they first started to look at things in Missouri, that it was like, oh, we're not doing enough. We need to change how we're approaching this. Like, is something like this kind of starting to turn the ship? And yeah, I don't know that personally. I see that like Hannah and Craig and Matt Zion are on, and they probably have a better sense of what's happening in Wisconsin these days to say if like there's been an impact. But I wish we had a way to track that, right? I wish that we could look and say like, this was what was happening pre-fire needs assessment, and here's what's been happening post-fire needs assessment.
This is Bill. As I'm looking at our data, I think our fires accomplished map after 10 years is going to have some really great data sets for people to slice and dice. They'll be able to look at specific agencies and see if their acreage fires done has increased or decreased or stayed the same. They'll be able to see things like how big was each burn unit. Were they grouping one fire next to another fire? Did they start burning in oak woods and included that? Did they start burning boundary to boundary instead of just sort of cherry picking the easy units? There's a lot of ways you can look at the data when you actually have polygons of fires accomplished. The next improvement on this map we'd like to do is have specific dates instead of just, we're just asking for ecological year of fire. And a lot of agencies are willing to give us the date of each polygon that they've got the burn unit done. So we're going to move towards that. But right now we're just trying to get in the habit of sharing data onto a statewide map. And as we gather more and more of this data, we'll be able to see a pattern. And of course, this year, you can imagine the pattern with COVID here that our amount of acreage just dropped way down. And We haven't, we're still collecting some of that data, but it definitely went lower. So, you know, there's going to be in the future a lot of ways to use data like this.
I think Tracy makes a good point. When thinking about developing a needs assessment, it makes sense to think about incorporating some type of evaluation of impact. I am not a social scientist, so I don't know how to do that. We have asked some of our sponsors, you know, if they've seen any traction with the modeling. As I mentioned, we have been presenting to resource managers and also kind of higher ups in the DNR in terms of decision making for the wildlife division. And one of our project sponsors has said that, you know, after the presentation of this project, there were some decision makers who said we need to burn more. So, you know, they didn't in 2020 because of COVID. We're still early in our project. We started in 2018. I'm hopeful that kind of the on the ground impact for resource managers who manage at kind of the smaller scales, that we'll see changes once we get our ArcGIS online tool out to resource managers so they can use that to help inform decision making. But yeah, it can be very hard to gauge impact unless you're explicitly trying to do that.
And I see Hannah has unmuted, so maybe you can provide some follow-up on the Wisconsin information.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Just kind of responding a little bit to Tracy's comments, and I'll share some perspectives of how I think it's really hit the ground in Wisconsin and been helpful and beneficial. And then I'd also defer to anybody in the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources that's on the call that might have some contributions too. In some ways, I think that doing the fire needs assessment, it was the integral step to creating the identified information gaps. And by that, I mean, we didn't know how much was being burned across the state. We still don't have a really good tracking system, but in part because of the fire needs assessment, it identified that information gap, and the Department of Natural Resources is moving forward on some pretty innovative mapping tools that can capture multi-partner information. And so I think that the fire needs assessment helped instigate some of that and helped give some teeth and some backing as to why that was important and why it was appropriate and advantageous for the department to kind of invest in some of those resources. Another area that I think was really telling is Wisconsin recently revamped the forest action plan for the state. And, you know, that's a pretty key planning tool for not just apartment lands, but forested lands across the state of Wisconsin. And the department did a really excellent job of just pulling in a wide variety of partners into that effort. And repeatedly throughout that document, it was referenced in the fire needs assessment that what had been identified in it. And I think it gave some really good scientific multi-partner input, multi-investment documentation for why it was important to have fire so integrated into the forest action plan. And I think that forest action plan has this week very recently just become formally finalized. And I think another example where it's been helpful is the Conservancy and the state and other partners have been able to reference this plan when applying for federal grant applications for grant funding. And it's great in a application when you can say, hey, there's a lot of people here who think fire is really good. Well, that's nice, but to have something that was, again, multi-partner, stakeholder, and kind of a group effort of identifying those needs, it gave so much more meaning to some of those successful applications. So I think those are some of the ways where it might not hit the ground in terms of this is how many acres we were burning and this is how many we're burning now, but there's lots of other subtle ways that those assessments are beneficial. And I'll stop there and see if anybody from Wisconsin DNR has anything to add.
This is Ryan O'Connor. I can jump in a little bit. We are pretty actively looking at revising the Wisconsin fire priorities some way, shape, or form. I think in some of our investigations, and I've talked to Josh a lot about their really great work in Michigan. One of the things that I think that we've learned that I would recommend for Minnesota is, really drill down and figure out like who you're doing this for. I think there's a lot of interest in sort of like statewide stuff, but like the product is going to look differently if it's for the state versus the feds versus the tribes. So figure out like who your primary audience is, and then also figure out like who are the decision makers for that group. So like, who is pulling the strings in terms of like making the decisions about where the burns are going to take place, who's on that team, who's on the teams deciding like what the resources are, and like make sure that those decision makers are part of your core team, part of your core stakeholders. Because if you want, in order to get it implemented, you're going to have buy-in up front from the decision makers. And that may mean doing things a little differently than what you might if you were just doing it as a scientific exercise. But I think like we're kind of proceeding slowly because we want to make sure those people are engaged and involved. So, and maybe I'll just stop there.
Yeah, that was very helpful to everyone. And then also thank you for Ryan and Hannah for chiming in there as well. And I think that ties in very nicely to a question we had here a few minutes ago from Emily that says, thoughts on taking an all lands approach right at the beginning, challenges, concerns to including private, as well as state, federal, tribal, etc. ownerships, pros and cons to adding ownerships later on in the process. And, we have a nice array from this. We've got, Tracy's Wisconsin example that is on these Huck 12s across all this ownership. Bill's example that's largely geared at protected lands. So whether that be, state, private, but also including these land trusts and other assorted groups that was highlighted in his map. And then to Josh's example, focused primarily on the DNR. And I think that ties in very nicely with Ryan's comment. I guess maybe we'll work from the broadest to the finest on just a feedback on how you feel like that works. If we start with Tracy and then maybe go to Bill and Josh on this one.
Yeah, so, I mentioned that was, before we even put together anything, we said, let's, basically let's include everything, right? Let's grab it, whether it's public, private, whatever, lump it all together. And some of that, again, was looking at it from the consortium perspective, where the consortium as the knowledge exchange, they're working with a big mix of people. So we wanted it to be a really inclusive product where, you wouldn't have like private landowners who felt that they weren't included. I think the issue could be that then, right, if you're trying to get some more fine scale data, like putting polygons on that, the data sharing might get tougher once you're dealing with like private land as opposed to, public land and public agencies. And I think it's really going to be about like where you want to start and where you want it to go. We started from this perspective as Wisconsin is the model. It's super inclusive and people could funnel down, as opposed to saying we're going to start with a subset of land and then people could add to it later.
And in Illinois, on the kind of protected lands decision, I imagine driven to a certain degree by the trackability of data. Is there any trackability of private lands data? Or is that just too challenging to try and tackle?
If you go to the website, what you see is how can I participate right in the middle underneath the Fires Accomplished map. And then when you click on that, it's really simple. There's a Gmail. You send your polygons to the Gmail. You can send us a hand-drawn map if you want, if you can just place it in the context of the landscape, and our contractor, Dave Holman, will input that data for you. Generally, though, we're not releasing private data. So we have, Dave has it, one of the attributes is if it's private, he won't share it with people. And we, so far, we're just sticking with that. Occasionally a private ownership is seen on the map, but we have the data. But really 99% of it is the public agencies that are giving us their data. But we kept it real simple, and we're willing to accept any data that people will give us, but we reach out to all the main players.
So, you know, our decision to use our Michigan Forest Inventory database was driven by the desire to be able to scale up. Decisions about fire are made at multiple scales. Resource managers managing specific parcels are, you know, looking at 25 to 250 acres sometimes. You know, site-specific decisions are at the fine scale, but, you know, coarser level evaluation informs decision at regional scales. So there's utility in having a model that's scalable, but whether or not you can accomplish that depends on the availability of data. We're limited in Michigan to having this wall-to-wall vegetative mapping on state lands. But I've always been envious of Minnesota and the county inventory and the wealth of stand level data in terms of releves. So I think as Minnesota thinks about the approach they should take, they should definitely think about what data sources are available. Can you do something with your county inventory data? Is there FIA data that you can use? We've, during our pause in state contracts because of restrictions, because of COVID, we started investigating data sets in Michigan from the U.S. Forest Service and National Lakeshore. So we've developed these models as well for Forest Service lands and National Lakeshore using their stand level data sets. Very different than the Michigan Forest Inventory data set. But then we also developed a statewide model using, as I mentioned, the 640 acre hexagons that are attributed with land fire data. It's very unsatisfying to model 4 million plus acres and still see so much white in a state. So, I mean, we recognize that there's utility in having the broad scale perspective of what's going on in the state and not just on state lands. So, you know, there's no reason you have to pick one approach necessarily. But if you do have access to fine scale data and you have it across multiple land ownerships, I think it's worth considering.
Hold on, I just had a 4-year-old invade the space here. And I see that there maybe is a comment from Wisconsin here on the utility of, everybody, you can say hi and then you can go bye. All right, go bye. Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so where were we? Any comment from Wisconsin folks here on, did you feel like you wanted finer scale data out of this? I see we've got a question that had come in a little while back on, this idea of, how fine scale do you need to be valuable? And so going all the way down to, maybe some of those stand by stand levels that we had with Josh's versus this broad scale. With the broad scale data, did you feel like you were finding limitations?
Can I respond to that a little? Oh, go ahead, Matt. Sorry.
Sorry, this is Matt. I'm with the DNR, and I guess maybe I'll try to address Tracy's effort first, and then talk to Michigan after that. So anybody that knows me knows that I'm a big, huge push for fire, and so I'm usually pretty disappointed about what we are getting done. So I'll preface it by saying that. But I will say, I think Hannah captured kind of the usefulness of Tracy's, or how it's been used to date, in that it's more, for me, it's less tangible than it is in real acres. Like, I think if you look at the new 2020 fire report that came out, Wisconsin in 18 and 19 had about 50,000 acres, all fire included. And I think, Tracy, your high end was like 48,000. So one could argue that we haven't made much progress in the acreage in that respect. But it certainly has given us, finally have a tool that we could point to, like Hannah said, instead of just saying we need more fire. It gave us something, right? We could say, look at this. And so now when we look at at a minimum, when we look at our properties now, it gives us also a kind of a landscape context. This property, but here it is with respect to the larger landscape that Tracy's effort can provide us. And so I would say, for me, as far as the implementation of Tracy's effort, I would say it, to some extent, it did kind of, this is where they all fall short, right? Its implementation, it did kind of fall short. It was there. Now we're kind of embarking on a new effort, a kind of a broader effort to establish habitat management goals in the state. And I think everybody can appreciate the first thing everybody wants to do is just do something different. And, so what I'm trying to get everybody to say is, okay, well, we have this great effort that Tracy did. Let's at least take a look at that. So I'm happy to say that I think in our effort, that's going to be incorporated into our new effort to kind of figure out where we should be working, where our priorities are. Having said that, to Michigan's effort, Michigan is set up like Wisconsin in that we have based on stands and compartments. And this has basically come from our forestry program. And so our agency has made a decision that WSFRs, the tool that captures that, is the tool that we're going to use. And so in all honesty, I think if we could have Michigan's tool right now, I think that would answer all the questions that we want. Scalability, being able to query it at different levels. It was so great to hear you talk about this user interface. These are all things we're talking about now. And so part of it is scale, wanting to be able to work at that stand level. But the other big part of it is that's the tool we're using. That's what forestry is based on. So there's just some logistical rationale for doing that as well. I think Michigan, as Ryan O'Connor, Ryan and I work a lot together, and Ryan has a tie to Michigan. The one big thing I think Josh just pointed about Minnesota is you have to some extent, Michigan has great data. So for Wisconsin, it's not just a matter of pulling in this great data. If you don't have it, you don't have it. So you have to have this great data. We have it to some level, but as I understand it, not to the extent that Michigan does. So we are working at that stand level now. It's likely to be more coarse than the Michigan effort until our agency decides that Michigan, like the Michigan model is what we really want, and they're willing to commit the resources to make that happen. My last comment, I think Hannah or somebody made this point too, is I think everybody here knows that to implement fire, it's more than just the knowledge of where it's needed, right? There's just so many elements to it. Part of it's certainly socio-political. And we spent a lot of time thinking about those southern states where it's like a state mandate. It's like a top down. Fire is important. We want it to happen. And so I think this earlier question about how do you use this data? Who do you talk to? I think that's hard to understate as well, is to present this to the people so you can get the top buy-in, and so you get greater support I think that helps a lot because what happens inherently, seemingly, is that the implementation of fire just seems to get more and more complicated. Just more and more, it gets more and more difficult. And so somehow we need to, on top of all this other stuff, we need to make fire not so complicated, not so difficult, not less safe. I'm not saying that. So I'll leave it at that. That's probably more than you wanted to hear, but that's kind of my overall take on that.
I like what Matt is saying about how the many factors of getting fire on the ground. It's a big commitment of an agency and of a burn boss and of a crew. And any way we can support that effort and build a sense of fire community like the southern states have, like the Flint Hills of Kansas have. To me, that's the goal of our Prescribed Fire Council. That's its main goal, is to support that community. And this data set is to support those people and try and be there, making them feel like they're part of a team. We have their back as they go through all the hassle of trying to get a prescribed fire done.
Well, thanks for all that kind of clarity on a variety of different topics. And I think it sounds, like in Wisconsin, the first coarser scale analysis was a great step one. And then now, from what I'm hearing, is kind of targeting a phase two, more along the line of what Michigan has, as well is an interesting idea to think through how Minnesota can go in that stepwise. We do have a few other questions here, but one thing I really wanted to make sure if anyone either just wants to, from a Minnesota perspective, either unmute or write in a chat, some things that you really would like to see come out of the Minnesota product as well. And so kind of turning this question back to the audience as opposed to directing it to the presenters. And I'll ask another one of these questions that we have sent in already while people are thinking on that. And if we don't get any questions along those lines, we can probably wrap this up here in a little bit, unless someone else has a question here. But so we have a question from Paul Priestley that came in. Can prescribed fire need be a first step in understanding wildfire risk? They are not a direct inverse of each other, but I think they are relatable. For example, jack pine is a fire-dependent species, but a longer return interval. The longer those stands go without fire, the greater the risk. Did you guys consider that maybe at all in Wisconsin, where you're kind of excluding those longer return intervals, on how that could pile up, I guess, if you don't include that information?
Michael, this is Hannah. Could I give a response to that? I'll share that it made sense at the time for us to exclude that, but when I look back on it, it's one of the regrets that I have, and I wish that we had addressed that in some way. I think it's also telling that even in the 5 years since we've done that assessment, a lot more has come to light, especially through some of the work that Jed Munier has done, looking at historical fire data, that what we thought was a 50-year fire return interval is in reality a much more frequent fire return interval. So it made sense at the time to exclude that because we were trying to see where the greatest need in the short term was. If I were advising and looking at doing this again in Wisconsin, I would not exclude longer fire return intervals. I'd like to include that now.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good kind of lessons learned component there. So that's helpful. I'm not seeing any questions from Minnesota folks on here. We've got a couple other questions that that haven't been addressed yet. So I'll go through those two here with folks. And then if we don't see anything else, we'll thank our presenters. But so the first one here we had was from Jim Manolis. Maybe this is kind of more of a reaction to one of the previous questions, but he has in Minnesota for a separate project, and Jim works for the Nature Conservancy, so maybe that helps to answer this. We partnered on developing an all lands layer that used existing public lands polygons and LiDAR derived polygons and metrics for private lands. I think this should be useful for the proposed fire needs assessment. So maybe that's more of a comment than a question. Anyone have a reaction? We'll move on from that one. And then the last one I have here is, could fire needs assessments be used in running future fire simulations and achievements to at least assess if the prioritization and ramp up will work? Has that thought been used in any of these processes? So using these to structure simulations, any experience with that for anyone who wants to comment?
We haven't done any simulations.
Okay, good.
Michael, if I could just jump in.
Yeah.
Jack is available to talk about the impacts of the initial fire needs assessment. He had some comments on that. Jack, you want to jump in?
Sure. I don't know if my video is showing or not, so I'm not going to worry about it. For some reason, it's blocked. So the initial fire needs assessment, yeah, it was a very coarse scale. It was kind of the first attempt. We had explored if there are other types of fire needs assessments, and we couldn't come across anything. So we were kind of the guinea pig trying it out. Again, the successes with that, and I did put in the chat box an example where it solidified some of the partnerships on working on fire across multiple ownerships, and where people were trying either fire in different seasons or trying to ramp up their programs. So it was a success for that because it gave kind of the big numbers of what we needed to try to achieve. And it was truly based more on ecological, but it did start really incorporating wildfire risk, kind of what Paul was referring to, especially when we're talking about the jack pine. And so an example is we kind of started looking at finer scale in certain areas, and some areas we never could get partners to ramp up fire, but where one of the areas was in that jack pine area of northern lower Michigan, where the Forest Service, for instance, and that required key individuals coming in who were willing to take on that challenge of putting fire on the ground in jack pine and red pine. But they really started increasing the acres they were burning, and also expanded out into different seasons of burning, and also looking at low intensity burning. And Paul, you referred to, an example of a crown fire that was a prescribed fire. So it kind of, I'm not saying that the fire needs assessment enabled all of that. What it did though is enabled that, hey, we need to keep working in this landscape, and it solidified kind of the partnerships and how to approach it. So they had kind of support from outside of their agency pointing to this type of document and saying, this is what we need to do, and we can do this on our ownership, but how do we expand onto private ownerships too? And so they have kind of their own localized fire needs assessment, so to speak, on how they can approach the wildfire risk, about where they strategically put fire breaks, where they need to be burning those fire breaks, where they need to be putting in for fuel reduction and timber management and prescribed fire and so on. And part of that's building that community relationship back up in an area where there was the Mac Lake wildfire, for example, and surrounding areas where there was a real fear of fire. So, that's an example where it took, 20 plus years? Well, Mac Lake is 30 years, but it took almost 20 years, 15 to 20 years of kind of toying around with this idea of prioritizing to get to the fact where they are now. They're still not at the acres that the fire needs assessment shows them they could be at, but they're a whole lot closer than it was in the past. So that's an example. I don't know if that's what you're looking for, Josh, or.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I guess another aspect of impact that, I mean, how do you gauge making people think? I don't know how. I mean, or inspiring conversations and getting to what Bill is talking about, trying to foster a community of people who are interested in fire ecology. So I think these needs assessments have those types of impacts. They're just, you know, it's not a concrete thing to make people think and think about changing behaviors.
Well, with a lack of any further questions, I think we're going to donate the remaining 18 minutes to everyone's lunch hour or whatever they choose to do after this. I thank all of the attendees that came in the lack of being able to clap. I guess there is a small reactions thing. I'll add a little clap on here to the Zoom. But thank you so much to all of the presenters here. To Bill, Tracy, and Josh, and then as well as everyone else who has, oh, look at it, just, you guys are getting thunderous applause coming in across Zoom here. Thank you to the participants who also chimed in as well, really helpful. And then for Paul and Jack to kind of help pull all this together. It's been a really interesting presentation this morning. And yes, we'll be looking forward to seeing how Minnesota's product can come together and leaning on the lessons learned from the other states as well. Anything you wanted to add, Paul or Jack, before we sign off?
Oh,
I do. I want to
go ahead, Jack.
I want to thank Bill and Tracy and Josh for stepping up and doing this. You know, it was not necessarily cold contact when I contacted you guys because I know you all, but you know, this is still a challenge to for your time and effort bringing this together. But I think it was very powerful to have these types of examples and to kind of celebrate the differences too. You know, that gets back to subject expertise and kind of the end product and how it can be used. So nicely done. Nicely done. Thank you.
You're welcome. It was nice to see colleagues I know on the call.
Thanks for the opportunity, Jack and Paul. And what about a Great Lakes fire needs assessment? Scale it up, compile all the effort eventually once Minnesota's done. Just a thought.
Deal. We'll do that with the next grant go around, okay?
I like it.
Oh, yeah, ditto everybody. Thank you so much for your time today. This is great collaborative effort to see managers and researchers combining efforts to make this happen. So look forward for more conversations in the future when this comes to life and we revisit it. As we learned, it's going to be a living document and we'll be talking about this for years to come. So appreciate your time, everybody. Thanks again. Have a safe new year and we'll be in touch.
And just one final note, some folks have asked if there'll be recordings. Yes, this is being recorded. Mike and I have all the notes for the chat box. We'll kind of get that condensed. I'll make it available on the website and we can also send it out to the email group at large.
Thanks, Jack.
Thanks all.
Take care, everybody.